Okay, so this is a podcast of the notes for 6.6. As you can see in this diagram, I hope you know that these are sperm over here on the right, and that this big reddish cell is an egg cell, and that these sperm are racing. They're competing with one another to get to the egg, and it looks like this guy's going to win. And we're going to talk a little bit about where these cells are made and where they meet and the anatomy of how all of this works. So you might think, oh, geez, we're doing FLE again. Yeah, it's a little bit of FLE, but we're going to come back to this system over and over during the school year. So number one, you got to draw and label diagrams of the adult male and female reproductive systems. So here's the male reproductive system. You need to be able to sketch this and label. And here are all the key parts. You need to be able to diagram the testicle, the epididymis, the vas deferens, the seminal vesicle, the prostate gland, the urethra, and the penis. The bladder is not really part of the reproductive system. It's just here to highlight a difference between the male and female reproductive pathway and the mechanism. So let me just, as you're drawing this, sketching this, adding labels, let me tell you a little bit about what happens in each of these places. In the testicle, the male reproductive cells, or the gametes, the male gametes, also known as sperm, mature. So they go through meiosis here, specifically spermatogenesis, which we'll go over a little bit more in another unit. But these cells, these male gametes or sex cells, develop here in the testicle. They finally mature here in the epididymis, and this is where they grow their flagellum or their tail, and then they swim their way through the vas deferens by the seminal vesicle, which adds some fluid, some lubricant to the sperm. They go through the prostate gland. Notice that there's a Y shape in here in the prostate gland, which we'll come back to in just a second. It continues to flow through the urethra and out the penis. I want you to come back to this section right here where the Y is. One is coming from the vas. One of these paths is coming from the vas deferens. The other is coming from the bladder, the urinary bladder. So this is where we store urine, and the urine is a solution of water and urea, or nitrogenous waste, that was a byproduct of digestion and use throughout the body, that's been filtered out of the blood through the kidneys and stored here in the bladder until it's released, following the same pathway as the sperm, which is going through the urethra and out the penis. And so this is one key difference in males, is that the urinary system, or the excretory system, shares the same part of the pathway as the reproductive system. Whereas here in females, you notice that here's the bladder and here's the urethra, which is a different passage than through the vagina. So here are a couple. Here are the terms that you need to know. You need to know. We'll start at the start of all this process, I guess. We'll start here at the ovary. Here's one ovary. Women have two ovaries. So here's the ovary. Here's a fallopian tube that leads to the uterus. Then there's the cervix. And the vagina, and then on the outside of the vagina, there's another diagram in just a moment. Then there's the labia. So the couple of parts that are labeled in this diagram that are not part of the reproductive system, we've got the bladder and the urethra, the pubic bone, and the large intestines and anus. All right, so here's a diagram from the front. And you should be able to draw both diagrams from the side as well as from the front. Here we've got the ovaries. So number two here is the ovary. Number one is the fallopian tube. We'll talk about this process in just a second. But the eggs develop here in the ovaries. They're released and are swept up by cilia and flow down the fallopian tube. 3 is the uterus, into the uterus. Number 4 is the cervix. Let me get these labels up. underneath here in the back here is the bladder. Again, that's not part of the reproductive system. 5 is the vagina, 6 is the hymen, and 10 is the vulva, also known sometimes as the labia. Here's the ureter, just as another key example of other systems that are all in very close quarters. The ureter is the tube that leads from these guys, which are the kidneys. Notice that they look like kidney beans. These kidneys that flow down into the bladder, and the urine is stored in the bladder and then released through the urethra, which actually sits in front of the vagina. Just a quick reference to the hormone video. Sitting on top of these kidneys is the adrenal glands that release adrenaline into our blood. Okay, so you need to outline the role of hormones in the menstrual cycle, including FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone, estrogen, and progesterone. So you should know how this all works, that the hypothalamus sends a signal to the pituitary gland, which is also part of the brain, that releases luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. But this is released through the blood, so it's not a nerve response, it's a hormonal response sent through the blood. And these two things impact what's going on here in the ovaries. What happens in the ovaries then affects progesterone and estrogen, which is made at the ovaries, sent through the blood, which sends a signal back to the hypothalamus. And so we've got this feedback loop between the ovaries, the uterus, and the brain. And when I say we, I mean women, not me. Okay, so here's a diagram that shows 4 different sets of data as time progresses through a menstrual cycle. And I want you to notice here on the bottom, this is the endometrial lining. This diagram shows the endometrial lining, or the lining of the uterus. And you notice that the cycle begins with menstruation. This is bleeding or release of the lining of the uterus. And we'll come back to this in just a moment. But the lining is released in the first few days of the cycle. What you notice going on with the hormones is that estrogen is increasing, but what we see is a spike, a small spike here in LH and FSH, and then a bigger spike right here, right before ovulation. And ovulation is the release of the egg from a maturing follicle. So a follicle stimulating hormone develops this follicle within which an egg is found. The luteinizing hormone releases that egg from the follicle and then destroys the corpus luteum. Luteinizing hormone destroys this old follicle immediately after ovulation. So we see this spike here and then an immediate decrease. But then what follows this immediate decrease is an increase in progesterone and estrogen, which is, if you remember from one of the previous slides, is made from the ovaries. And what happens as a result of this is an increase in the endometrial lining of the uterus, which is key because after ovulation, what's happening is that the uterus is trying to create a bed in which an egg, hopefully fertilized, that's what this system is designed for, that the fertilized egg is able to nestle into the uterine lining, implant, and develop into an embryo and a fetus. Okay, so here's a diagram. This ovary doesn't actually move around, but it's just through time. Notice it's not touching the oviduct or the fallopian tube, but we've got an ovary within which we have a follicle. The FSH increases. We see FSH increasing, and then luteinizing hormone causes the release of the egg and the degradation of the corpus luteum, this little thing inside the ovary. Well, this egg, which is actually going to be out here in the space between the ovary and the oviduct, gets swept up by these finger-like things called fimbriae that pull them in. Cilia is pulling the egg through, and it's here in the fallopian tube that fertilization normally happens. And once that happens, the cell starts to divide, going through mitosis, dividing, getting more and more cells, and it finds its way here into the uterus, that in which the egg implants. But remember, immediately after after ovulation, right here, we see a reduction in FSH and LH and an increase in progesterone and estrogen made by the ovary. Well, this ovary is sending a hormone to the nearby uterus, which allows it to increase the lining for in case the egg gets fertilized, so it can implant. But in the event that the egg does not implant, we see estrogen and progesterone decrease, which reduces the endometrial lining, which is what causes menstruation. So there's bleeding, but there's also the release of the unfertilized egg. And here's another diagram. By the way, these slides will be posted on Blackboard. You need to be able to annotate or add notes to a graph showing hormone levels in the menstrual cycle, illustrating the relationship between the changes in hormone levels and ovulation, menstruation, and thickening of the endometrial lining. So here's a diagram, but here's some good annotation. So in days 1 through 4, here at the beginning, we've got menstruation. Endometrium is shed. We see an increase in FSH, and then between days 5 and 14, which is the ovulatory phase, we see that FSH and LH increase, which cause ovulation. And then the end is the luteal phase, which is where LH and FSH decrease, where estrogen and progesterone increase here at the end. See LH and FSH dropping. We've got estrogen and progesterone staying pretty high. And if no fertilization or implantation occurs, progesterone and estrogen drop, triggering menstruation and FSH. So if you read between the lines here, it says if no fertilization and implantation occurs. So fertilization can occur, but not implant. So oftentimes, and it's hard to know, but doctors actually estimate that about 50% of the time, women don't know that they have a fertilized egg, and because the egg did not implant, the hormonal reaction that occurs when the implantation occurs doesn't happen. So the body goes through its natural cycle and gets rid of the endometrial lining along with this egg that is not very far along in its development, but it was a fertilized egg. And here are some more notes. So here are four hormones. FSH and LH are released by the pituitary gland of the brain, estrogen and progesterone by the ovaries. And here are two others, HCG and oxytocin. So HCG, which is made when the egg implants into the lining, keeps estrogen and progesterone high to maintain that high endometrial lining so that the embryo is able to develop a placenta and continue to develop and not be shed out of the system. So HCG is actually the hormone that home pregnancy kits look for. If you've got lots of HCG, then that's an indicator that you're pregnant. Oxytocin is another hormone, which is, I think, actually quite interesting. Oxytocin is sometimes known as the love molecule. This actually is if you look at the hormone video, nerves, hormones, and homeostasis, I talked about a negative feedback loop. Oxytocin is related to a positive feedback loop. So there is a runaway effect. But it is a birth hormone, and it causes contractions of the uterus. And it's also related to bonding between individuals, between partners, and as well as between mom and child. And if you want to know more about that, just ask. We can talk about it in class. All right, so you got to list 3 roles of testosterone. 1, it causes male genitalia to develop in the fetus. It causes secondary male sex characteristics to develop during puberty. So muscle mass increases, length of bones increase, so that is related to a growth spurt. Increase in length of vocal cords. So I think of instruments quite often when I think about this. If you think of a flute, which is quite short, you think of, I always think of its high pitch. But if you think of like a tuba or a sousaphone or something that's longer, then it's got a deeper tone. So the vocal cords increase, which means that the tone or the pitch of the voice actually drops in males. And then spermatogenesis begins. So this is when males begin to make sperm. This is the meiosis of sperm in males. Whereas, as you probably know, females don't go through what their equivalent, which is oogenesis. At puberty, they start that process before they're born. When they start that process as a fetus, it goes into a pause until girls hit puberty. And then there's the growth of the penis and testes, which are some of the other male sex characteristics. There's also increase of body hair as another thing. And then lastly, it maintains sex drive. So that's the role of testosterone. We talked about some of the hormones that are made in the ovaries. Testosterone is made in the testes of males, or the testicles. All right, so we got to talk about IVF, which is a little bit of a separate idea, but it is related to the reproductive system. So the reasons that one may consider having IVF or in vitro fertilization, which you might know, sometimes it's known in the media as test tube babies, but if a dad has a low sperm count, there's anatomical defects or disease in the fallopian tube scarring, then one may elect to go through in vitro fertilization. And essentially what happens in vitro fertilization is that there's a hormone stimulation so that the eggs develop in the hormones. These eggs are extracted. So egg and sperm are joined together in a lab setting. So here's a test tube, but it's not necessarily in a test tube. But these eggs are fertilized. They develop into an embryo. They get put back into a syringe and injected back into the uterus. And oftentimes they put in more than one because there's likely something about this environment that is preventing pregnancy. So there's not a high chance that they're going to be, there may not be as high of a chance that they're embedding into the uterine wall. So often doctors put in more than one, which can be problematic. That's what happened here with John and Kate with their last, I don't want to say litter of kids, but it's kind of what it was. Or with Octomom. They put in more than they hoped for, and more than one implanted. So here's another slide. So they inject hormones to induce menstruation and ovulation. They do an ultrasound. There's a little more detail. They put in synthetic FSH to develop those follicles and the eggs. They treat with LH to loosen the egg to cause ovulation. They collect the eggs from the ovary. They collect sperm. They fertilize the two. They select embryos, which we'll talk about in just a second. They can select embryos. They transfer the embryos to the uterus or directly to the oviduct. But if the oviduct has scarring, what they're doing essentially is bypassing the fallopian tube so that they can take the eggs from here. If there's not a way for them to get through the fallopian tube, or let's say the fallopian tube is collapsed, sometimes that happens, they can bypass this altogether and put them straight into the uterus. They do a pregnancy test, which is an HCG test, and see if it implanted or not. So there's some ethical issues, obviously, with IVF, and as IB students, you need to be able to understand other points of view and perspectives, and critically evaluate them. So here are some. So the ones here on the left are against having IVF, and the ones on the right will be for having IVF. So some people may make this argument that sometimes the infertility for the reason for which people are considering IVF could be inherited, and so that doesn't really solve the problem. It's going to continue down generation after generation. Some people make the argument that the extra embryos are killed, so not all of them implant. And this obviously invites the next ethical question that you're probably asking about, which is, when does life start? Is it at conception? Is it at birth? And that leads to the next thing that you probably associate with that kind of debate, which is abortion. And what is death? And can embryos feel pain? But this is an argument that people make against having IVF. Some people say that this is humans playing God. Humans are doing something outside of what's considered natural. So that one follows. But the pros are that sometimes the infertility could be environmental and not genetic. So this one-time fix, at least one time in the generations, could alleviate the stress in a family of not having a child. Some people make the claim that the embryos feel no pain because they're undeveloped. There are few cells. Their nervous systems haven't developed. They don't have neurons quite yet, so they don't feel pain. Parents could screen for embryos, which opens up to another ethical issue you might already be thinking about. So parents could look at embryos, do genetic sequences, figure out which ones might be more susceptible to certain genetic conditions, and you might consider, oh, well, that's a good thing. It would not be beneficial to have a child who has cystic fibrosis. But the runaway effect on that would be, can you screen for traits that you like? And what does that mean about societal norms and preferences in society? But that's something else for another day that we can talk about. And then some people say that if parents are willing to go through in vitro fertilization, they must be good parents. I don't know how you fall on that, where you fall on that, but that's an argument that often is made. And lastly, that going through IVF circumvents childlessness. So this allows parents who are unable to have their own biological children to have their own child. And that wraps up this discussion.